In which case, I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of the BCS Women's Specialist Group and also the Hampshire branch, Margaret Ross, and we're delighted to have a fantastic speaker today. But in a moment, I'm going to pass on to Irene, who's going to introduce her. But just to mention that we're not going to take any questions during the presentations because we will be recording. We'll start.
I'm from Coventry branch at BCS, and I've also been involved in other ways with BCS. And I found out about 2 minutes ago that I was doing this introduction, so it's very ad lib. So I first met Frances around about 1991, 92, I think, when she was an academic at Keele. And she was a key member of the Women into Computing group, and that was a really powerful organisation that existed at those times. And then I lost touch with her until quite a few years ago when I was in Germany for a birthday party, and we started to talk about people that we knew, and Frances's name came up, and I was told that she was trying to get a book published, or she'd been working on a book, and it had gone very cold. So we've been working together ever since, haven't we, Frances? And
yes,
earlier on, about 6 months ago now, she eventually managed to get the book published after an awful lot of trouble, which I'm sure she's going to tell you all about. So it's been quite a long journey, but Frances has been working on this field, on the problem of gender and computing for a very long time. She's going to tell you quite a lot about it. She's got some fantastic research that deserves sharing, and the book gives her that opportunity to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Frances, and who will give us the talk. Thank you, Frances.
Hello. Good evening, everybody. And I wish you a very warm welcome on this International Women's Day. And here's hoping that these celebrations get stronger and stronger. The title for this talk is Righting the Wrong, from my recently published book, And What About the Future? Not least because I'm delivering it during a British Science Week, for which the theme focuses on the future. Throughout my working life, I've seen some improvement in the loss of women in most STEM subjects, but not much, and most particularly almost no improvement amongst women in computing. So I have little hesitation in focusing during the first part of this presentation on aspects of the history of computing which have nurtured this seemingly everlasting state of affairs. Next. While preparing this talk, I was startled and struck to come across this aphorism of Yogi Santayana from 1905, which I hadn't met before. Many of you may well have done. It reads, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." I was struck because it seems to me to apply so perfectly to women's role in computing. Although women and girls clearly use computing technology very proficiently, they are still not present in acceptable numbers at the cutting edge and prominently participating in and guiding this technological development. As a group, they still accept what they're given. Indeed, after over 5 decades of working in computing, superficially it may have changed, but I still detect a reluctance amongst those who control the industry to acknowledge this. Slide. Next. So, some basic data. In the 1980s, in the United Kingdom, the numbers of women studying computing in higher education was very low, 12 to 15% if you were lucky. Now, a mere 16% of those enrolled on computer science undergraduate courses in the UK are female. Of course, what it will be like in 2030, we don't yet know. My recent book covers many topics that arose and challenged me over my career. So I shall itemize a few, and then I can respond to your queries. First, I'll mention the commonly regarded foundations of computing: science, engineering, and mathematics, and ask just how valid their influence still is. Secondly, I want to look at how power operates in the situation in which we find ourselves. And finally, suggest how we might challenge the present direction of power, and particularly with respect to AI. Next. All three foundations, science, engineering, and mathematics. Yes?
Nancy, sorry to interrupt. I don't think Margaret's sharing the screen. Margaret, can you share the screen, please?
Is it sharing?
Thank you. Yes,
It is now. It is now. Sorry about that, everyone.
Thank you. Have they been seeing the slides?
No, they haven't.
They haven't.
They are seeing it now. Do you want to go? Do you want to just go back to the first one and just recap very, very
Yes,
briefly?
I'll recap very, very quickly. Yes, please.
Yeah. Go to previous.
Oops.
That'll do. Here are the statistics. Oh, right. Here's the aphorism. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I suggest that that's happening to computing if we don't watch it. Next. The statistics about women in computing at first degree level. 12 to 15% in the 1980s, 16% in 2020, and we don't know what about 2030 yet. So the next slide, please. The foundations. These three foundations, science, engineering, and mathematics, are, of course, masculine-dominated subjects. This much is history. It's happened, and there's nothing that can be done to change it. And my intention is to alert you again to this history and how these influences operated in the past and still are influential. So if I take science first, it's important to stress that I'm focusing on image and public perception and how history has influenced these, and still does. The title computer science still dominates the world of computing amongst native English speakers. I have read papers describing how the subject became a science. That, I would argue, at that stage of the development of computing was an impossibility. The traditional meaning of science was to study the natural world in order to explain phenomena on the basis of evidence gathered. Examination of the way computers perform is self-referential. It is examining man-made phenomena arising from within the subject itself. So this is not a science in that traditional usage of the word. Whether or not advanced AI will change that situation is a point yet to be argued. You may ask, what's wrong with stretching the meaning of the word science? After all, many terms take on new meanings. The answer seems to me to be a political one. Computing post-World War II, when this label began to appear, was young, and I would suggest unsure of itself. It was searching for a place in the hierarchy. Scientists are revered, so it seemed an apt title for those looking for prestige, but there were to be consequences. Let us look first at the traditional masculinist view of science from the Greeks onwards, views that laid foundations which we cannot ignore. These show how science was frequently conceptualized by the use of sexual metaphor, always at the expense of women. Plato, in his Symposium, suggested that in heterosexual love, women were subject to powerful emotional influences, which disqualified them from holding an equal place in scientific investigation. Women's supposed emotionality continued to be a bar to their inclusion in scientific practices. On the other hand, of course, men's presumed lack of emotionality allowed them to be admitted. Next. This kind of attitude continued. In the Renaissance, alchemists, while looking for harmony and love between men and women, were frequently misogynistic and contemptuous of women. The alchemist Thomas Vaughan wrote in the mid-17th century that the soul of man consists chiefly of two portions. The superior is masculine and eternal, the inferior feminine and mortal. Next. And then Francis Bacon's characterization of science in the 17th century, which later came to be known as experimental science, was coercive. Nature is seen as female, and her male investigators are depicted in Bacon's metaphors as dominating her. Science, he wrote, was to conquer, subdue, and storm her castles and strongholds. Then there are, of course, rape metaphors. Men should make no scruple of entering and penetrating into these holes and corners when the inquisition of truth is his whole object. Next. Joseph Glanville, later to become a Fellow of the Royal Society, wrote in 1661, "Where the will or passion hath the casting voice, the case of truth is desperate. The woman in us still prosecutes a deceit, like that begun in the garden. And our understandings are wedded to an Eve, as fatal as the mother of our miseries." Women were seen as a danger to the pursuit of truth and science. These 17th century philosophers had become preoccupied with the dangerous female sex. Next. And this continues. The secretary of the Berlin Academy of Sciences wrote in the early 18th century that it was being burdened with ridicule because its astronomic calendar was being prepared by the widow of a recognized and respected German astronomer. They didn't want her doing that work anymore. I can't use the word employed because she wasn't paid. The scene has been set a long time and continues in various forms well into the 20th century and beyond. Women made contributions to the scientific work of Bletchley Park in World War II, as well as huge clerical contributions. There was one group of women who worked with a well-known cryptographer, Dilly Knox, who were known as Dilly's Fillies. It must be noted that although there was respect on both sides, he respected them as they respected him. I cannot now view this as respectful. Labels like these keep groups firmly in their place. I've put in here a reference to Emily Chang's book, Brotopia, Breaking Up the Boys' Club of Silicon Valley, published in 2019. Not because she makes a specific point about the influence of the far distant past on women's current position, but because her whole book describes in striking detail what's happening to women in Silicon Valley in the 21st century. And it contains many points relevant to us here and now. On the question of the roots of the present situation, her emphasis on the more recent past. But she is clear that so many of our present computing culture problems arose from the absence of women as Silicon Valley grew. And I'll mention her book again towards the end. Returning now more explicitly to science, women's supposed emotionality has barred them from being as objective as is necessary for scientific observation. Keeping women out seemed to have become as important as experimentation. But there's no evidence that there was any experimentation to test these assertions. Modern feminist philosophers still criticize science for not allowing self-examination of its method. We follow the science, has often been heard recently. Certainly, those who utter it are passing on the responsibility to someone else at the same time as giving those people status, although scientists themselves now seem much more reticent about their role. The traditional impact of We Follow the Science was to give status to those who become scientists, and for many, this male club can seem attractive. Having suggested that the term science was acquired to give computing masculine status when it had so little to do with conventional scientific practices, I shall leave that for a moment and move on to engineering. Next. The influence of engineering is somewhat different. Engineering was originally about realigning matter to achieve a desired physical end. Engineers typically produce artifacts. For these traditional spheres, the word engineer invokes the image of a man doing heavy work. There are many other more modern usages of the word that do not directly connote muscular strength: genetic engineering and social engineering, to name but two. But nonetheless, the verb to engineer still suggests power, coercion, and manipulation. Computer hardware is an artifact. Its design and construction require the skill of electronic engineers, and we need engineers to maintain it. So this term is absolutely appropriate in the traditional sense when applied to these activities in computing, even though the need for physical strength has gone. As the boundaries between hardware and software become more diffuse and functions achieved by hardware became implemented in software, there has been a not unreasonable tendency to talk of software engineers. The history of engineering in the world of education and training is an interesting one. It was not always the most prestigious qualification to have, but above all, it was universally recognized as masculine. This masculine foundation led to social consequences for all types of engineering working environments. Particularly, it has led to connections and bonding between men. For example, social brotherhoods in which men bonded together. This bonding is, I believe, reinforced by the presence of hardware and other technical equipment and the near absence of women. The humorous exchanged amongst these groups was often sexist, denigrating women and minorities. These social brotherhoods are one type of brotherhood. Another is the professional associations. Once software engineering became established, many of these features I have just alluded to were carried forward into this new engineering discipline. I quote Sally Hacker, who wrote tellingly about this in the 1980s. It's not easy to throw off these modes of conversing as a new discipline becomes established. Moreover, the overarching presence of men asserting their dominance didn't help. Even now, it's difficult to deny the impact of the verb to engineer, not least because of the many other contexts in which that verb is used. Through all the discussions amongst UK heads of computer science about how the discipline of computing could acquire the status of engineering during the 1990s, I never heard a word mentioned about the impact of all this on female perceptions. It just never occurred. The seeming absence of such discussion I find shocking. My last word on this here tonight is that engineering could have been a more justified label than science, but that would not have dealt with the masculine overtones. Next.
Francis, I'm going to interrupt you again. I'm sorry. I understand that people still can't see the slides, and I don't know why, because I know Margaret's sharing them. And it looks as though they should be shared. Margaret has control. I don't know what else we can do to share them.
Is that sharing now?
I can see them.
I can't see what everybody else is seeing, you see, that's a problem.
No, that's the problem. I can't either. So there are two people. Various people have got. Kay, would you like to talk? Kay?
Yes, I can see the slides perfectly well. but I missed about 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning when the other lady was speaking. Was that important?
No, we didn't start showing any slides until the Francis started talking.
Yes, the slides are fine. I see them very well, but I just missed the talk at the beginning.
No, that was just
Okay.
actually saying we're recording purely on the Francis's talk.
I
Right,
see.
thank you, Kate. We'll continue.
Shall I
Sorry to
click?
interrupt, Francis.
Can
Shall I
you
click?
confirm? Can you still see the slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we okay to continue now?
Yes, please.
So we're now looking at mathematics. Unlike science, the foundational status of mathematics in modern computing is unarguable. Mathematics certainly has a place in the computing canon. Mathematics has contributed so much to computing, not least to the work of Alan Turing and his colleagues at Bletchley Park, and many others following on from World War II. In the early days of post-war computing, people used to respond to a mention of computing by saying, that's about maths, isn't it? And all those early laptops went straight into the maths departments, and teachers had to teach themselves how to teach about them. But gradually, and as computing techniques were put to wider use, this image has slowly shifted. Girls so often like mathematics. I did, as did a great aunt of mine, who earned a degree in it in the late 19th century, and who subsequently taught it in a girls' school for decades. And I've seen so many others enjoy it. Those of us who didn't fear mathematics managed to get on with it. So in short, I'm not so sure that it serves to deter women as much as people often suggest. But many girls and women shun it too, and the negative association of mathematics with computing has remained. Once matriculation requirements for mathematics for entry into university computing courses were relaxed in the UK, there were plenty of other topics of potential interest which shifted the focus of attention. The history of mathematics as a disciplinary subject is interesting. It was often taught for a variety of reasons not entirely related to the content of the discipline itself. For example, it was claimed that it taught self-discipline and self-restraint. Ada Lovelace's tutor, Dr. William Kin, suggested that concentrating on mathematics would tame Ada's unruly thoughts. And since the subject has no connection with feelings, it could not possibly raise objectionable thoughts. And there are plenty more quotations like that from the 19th century. And in 1980, a professor of mathematics suggested the main function of mathematics is to maintain social stratification. So its introduction into the curriculum has a strange history. And I would suggest that some of these features are still present in the teaching methods. But some of us love it for itself. We do need some mathematical topics and training in computer courses. However, its role in computing is still an interesting one in terms of power, as I've investigated in a chapter on the subject in my recent book. But that's not what I'm concerned about at this moment. In the early days, mathematics was seen purely as a foundation that certainly helped to deter women, but it never competed for a label. Even though, to this day, many institutions have schools and departments allying these two disciplines in their titles. Next. Next. There's not much on the next slide, actually. So it just says labels. Next. What labels do we want? Are the slides okay?
I think we're showing the one about Michael.
No, we've still got the mathematics slide on.
Now put labels up. a single word on the slide, almost. Before that, back. What labels do we want? Computing, and more importantly its applications, have become so diverse now that many titles are relevant. And for my pennyworth, I suggest that the core stuff should be called informatics. It's not exactly new, but it has a certain simplicity and evokes technicalities. Clearly, there are now plenty of meaningful titles for the many options strongly related to computing that are now on offer. AI, robotics, software engineering, and numerous others that are growing in importance. So perhaps we could discuss that at the end if anyone wants to, or maybe it's just got too boring for now, I don't know anyway. So I'm now moving on to the second part of my talk, which is about power. Next. It's important that we try and understand better how power operates. If we can understand what's happening, then perhaps we can consider how we might shift the directions of power. Next. I have found the writings of Michel Foucault helpful in my efforts to understand the mechanics of power. He said in an interview, "When I think of the mechanics of power, I think of its capillary form of existence, of the extent to which power seeps into the very grain of individuals, reaches right into their bodies, permeates their gestures, their postures, what they say, how they learn to live and work with other people." In responding to this in the present circumstances where men still dominate computing, I see many intertwining capillaries or strands reinforcing one another to arrive at the present situation. There is no single overarching God or force. No one person or set of people can be held responsible. There exists a set of circumstances determining that we find ourselves in this situation. But these networks of capillaries or strands have to be unraveled so we can identify what and where the pressures are. The question is how to achieve this disentangling. Next. I want now to talk about resistance to the pressures exercised through these capillaries. When we do not resist them, we connive at and endorse them. For example, if we hear some denigrating reference to female capabilities in the workplace, how often do we challenge this? I shall give a microscopic and slightly complex example of conniving which occurred in the early 1990s and which I observed. It is about computing technology and one of those small day-to-day occurrences, the like of which we so often observe. I worked in an open plan office writing software systems for the National Health Service, a reasonable mix of men and women. One day, a female colleague came in hiding something under her coat. She had just acquired what was at that time, for the average dressmaker, an advanced sewing machine with which you could embroider decorations and names on garments. As the day advanced, I observed her surreptitiously but proudly showing her handiwork to a few female colleagues. Being a sewer is what is generally regarded as a female occupation or hobby, and it certainly was at that time. She didn't seem to want to make a public demonstration of what she had achieved with rather complex technology and her own programming skills. It was for us at that time technically interesting, and yet she didn't seem to want to make it public. I inferred that she had absorbed the dominant view of this activity and by her partial action was exercising a negative capillary action by not broadcasting it to the office. The men didn't see anything, but she was by her actions telling her female colleagues what she thought she ought to do. This is a small example that affected a small community, but nonetheless is typical of what happens all the time. I want next to give a different example of the way in which power can operate, but at a macro level, rather than the micro example I've just given. This time it is quite close to home, and I feel strongly that it should be aired. This one hit me hard when I was working to get my recent book published. An approach to the publishing arm of the British Computer Society met with some advice. I was reassured in a letter that a woman in the BCS had been consulted, from which I inferred that this somehow sanctioned the response I was being sent. I believe that if I had done what was suggested in this letter, my proposals, like so many others, could be guaranteed to have little or no impact. I was very conscious of my ideas being kicked into the long grass. The tone and circumstances of their suggestions were such that I was impotent to resist them. I was advised that the topics weren't appropriate for an audience of, quote, business and IT managers and professionals. Another inference sprang into my mind that the primary objective of such organizations is to focus on furthering the discipline and encourage all the current and future technical work without being diverted. To put it another way, the BCS publishing arm is presenting the computing industry as devoid of an understanding of social structures and is not actively interested in equality for women. Next. I now assert that a primary objective of a professional body representing the industry must from henceforth, the objective would be to do everything in its power to increase opportunities for women in whatever way necessary until equity is realized. The organization has a moral duty, like so many other similar organizations, to ensure that the best people are always recruited. If you end up consistently missing out almost half of an identifiable part of the population, you cannot possibly have employed the best available. The present situation is a shameful state of affairs that requires an urgent tectonic shift. In short, it's a scandal. If a particular initiative about gender competes with furthering the discipline in the most technical sense, then improving opportunities for women should override this. There seems to be a certain coyness about explicitly tackling the near absence of women. Is it a topic that's found difficult to face in a meaningful way? Maybe the time has come to include something more explicit about this state of affairs in, say, the organization's bylaws. Next. The dangers in the present situation. The discipline is diverging as more and more computing-related specialties gain credence and attract students. The danger is that present practices, including their biases, become so embedded in automating systems that they become undetectable and the biases remain. And the most discussed topic is, of course, AI. So I shall concentrate on AI for a moment. This particular danger was highlighted in an article in the New York Times in 2019, headed, "The gender gap in computer science research won't close for 100 years." Wondering if indeed this gender gap would ever close. It was one of many articles in a similar vein. The concerned voice here is that the gender bias that is becoming increasingly present in so many aspects of academic research, that parity might only be reached by 2137 or possibly never. Once these biases are so deeply entrenched and increasingly rely on established practices and algorithms, so often devised by a self-defined group, they will be impossible to disentangle. The increasing use of AI in algorithms for aspects of employment like hiring, assessing CVs, is likely to affect irreparably the interlinking predilections of those building the systems. I can't move on without reminding you of the Amazon debacle reported in the press in 2018 of the CV vetting system, which rejected all CVs, including the word women. It makes one wonder how the number of able and qualified women rejected while that system was live. There are many other branches of computing where we could unwittingly be building in bias: machine learning, robotics programs, face recognition, games, software design, and so on. Unless we take some action to understand what is happening, the trend could become irreversible and potentially damaging to the future of all women. Many are well aware now of the potential and actual problems with facial recognition. Robotics is another problem area that is advancing steadily. Research into the impact robotics have on women's working lives, let alone their personal lives, is yet to be fully undertaken. As Caroline Preciado Perez's book, Invisible Women, points up so successfully, women just don't figure in design and planning. Old systems have built them out, and new ones are doing a pretty good job of continuing this process. Next. In the past, when I wrote about these things, I was always told it's not computing, which was reckoned to be enough to silence me. The problem is that science and engineering disciplines tend not to subject themselves to empirical investigation as other disciplines are required to. The contemporary feminist philosopher of science, Sandra Harding, suggests that hypotheses about science's role in social affairs and producing computer systems is part of social affairs, that these hypotheses should be open to the same kind of investigation as a science such as physics itself uses. She writes, for example, why is it taboo to suggest that natural science is a social activity, a historically varying set of social practices? And later, to what other community of natives would we give the final word about the causes, consequences, and social meanings of their own beliefs and institutions? She talks about sacred science, which places science itself above and beyond scrutiny. Computing called itself a science and joined the club of sciences, thus placing itself above and beyond scrutiny. Next. So we must scrutinise topics such as AI. There is a BCS Ethics Committee which holds events on AI, but none ever seem to explicitly and emphatically highlight gender. Discrimination, yes, but not enough about gender. And there's also a relatively new development on this front. The BCS has now classed AI as one of its priorities, stating that AI risks having bias and discrimination hardwired in, and seems determined to equip AI practitioners with the right ethical skills. They established a strategy board of experts in early 2020 to examine ethical practice. This looks promising. The goals look like the right ones, but so far I found little detail on how they're going to be achieved. Ethics is a highly complex subject. Moreover, we will need to resolve the problem of how far the damage is already done by being hardwired in after so many decades of bias against women. When I run through the current videos of regional BCS meetings introducing AI, the overbearing male enthusiasm and the way it will improve the lives for all is concerning. To me, it sounds like more of the same. In short, what I've been listening to since the early 1970s. They seem to be proposing a revolution that won't be a revolution at all. We'll get what we like, what we want. Will ideas on healthcare really reflect women's healthcare needs? Are the majority of women really interested in autonomous cars? Judging from what I was listening to in these videos, I somehow doubt it. Next. What is to be done? We must admit just how serious the situation is and be conscious of the image we present. Don't patronize women. Get them talking about changes that are needed and accept their recommendations. Don't put up with difficult equipment. Everybody should challenge what they don't understand. Ethics committees must investigate and act. There should be much more input to and discussion of education policies at all levels. Maintain oversight of employment decisions in member organisations and ask them to collect and return statistics on how many women applied for jobs, their qualifications, how many they interviewed, whom they appointed. Maintain better oversight of projects. Not just are they taking women's needs into account, but how are they doing this? It's work, yes, but it's got to be done. Next. I return now to Emily Chang, whom I mentioned earlier. In her last chapters, she expresses her frustration about how little has been achieved in making the industry diverse. And she makes this telling admonishment. Stop blaming everybody else for the problem or pretending that it's too hard for us to solve. It's time to look in the mirror. Next, and final slide. Chang has many suggestions about making the workforce more diverse. Shaking up the interviewing procedures, for example, where to source candidates, ensuring diverse interviewing teams. Keeping records, as I suggested above, things will only change gradually. For example, if you have to wait for the right employee, then you should wait instead of employing the first apparently qualified man who turns up. Certainly, the increasingly wide range of applications will bring diversity and maybe lead to employing more artists and musicians. There is evidence that people outside fortress computing are beginning to realize the kind of change that is needed, and particularly with respect to the young. So here's my plug for the Three Bears Panto. I do commend Jenny Price's Three Bears coding program for 2020 from her Get With The Program website. There are other websites too, which people are recommending for slightly older children, like Scratch, and then there's the Girls Who Code. Thank you, everybody. I shall be very interested to hear of novels ideas you have come across for widening the scope of specialities and attracting diverse qualifications. Thank you.